Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. It feels like it's been so long. Those were only about 30 minutes ago. So obviously the news broke today that Billy Schrauth committed to Notre Dame. If you are a member of the Irish Breakdown Premium Board, you knew about this a few days ago. Still, the timing does not matter. It's a big commitment. So my name is Brian Driscoll. I'm the publisher of IrishBreakdown.com. Joined today by my man, Brian Smith, the publisher of Inside the Nights, which is the UCF site for Sports Illustrated. And also, but of course, Brian, in his heart of hearts, is always
a Notre Dame fan.
So Brian's going to join us. We're going to talk about Billy Schrauth's commitment. We're going to do a little backstory. We're going to break down his game. We're going to watch some film. And we're going to talk about this offensive line class as a whole. We're also going to be joined here in a little bit by John Garcia from SI All-American. John's going to give us his thoughts on the O-line class and where he sees Notre Dame, kind of how this impacts Notre Dame's rankings and things along those lines. So we're going to have a good, fun show for you today. We'll also have a show tomorrow, a recruiting show tomorrow night around 7 o'clock. We will cover the pending announcement by Justin Rhett, a top 50 2023 player. He's a cornerback from Bishop Gorman. He will decide between Notre Dame, Alabama, Georgia, Oklahoma, and Tennessee. We will carry that live as well. But we are going to talk today about Billy Schrauth. Brian, this has been a bit of a wild recruitment because Billy, so basically I was told, I think this is back in like February, maybe March, that Billy was in the class. Silently, still wanted to take some visits, but like he told Notre Dame he was coming. Faded a little bit. Wisconsin made a push. There's an in-state, obviously going to be a strong in-state push to stay in state. There were some other things going on behind the scenes. There were some issues with the offensive line coach. There were some things kind of going on that were drawing him to Wisconsin and away from Notre Dame. And then Ohio State got in the mix, and they made a push too. But at the end, it came down to Notre Dame and Wisconsin. And he sort of left the class. There was a period of time where Notre Dame was basically out. I mean, looked like it was going to be Wisconsin. But there was one person that never stopped recruiting Billy Schrauth, that viewed him as the top lineman that they needed to get in this class, and is the primary reason Billy Schrauth committed to Notre Dame today, and that is Tommy Rees.
Congrats to him on that. That was really smart.
I mean, he grinded this one away. I mean, when it looked like Notre Dame was out, somebody just sent me a quote. I got to read you this, Brian. Somebody just sent me a story that Tom Lloyd put out. Now, this is a free story.
Here we go.
This is a VIP story, so I'm only going to read one little part. If you want to read the rest of it, you need to read it. But this is something that somebody sent to me. He talked about meeting Coach Freeman, and he said, Coach Rees and Coach Freeman came to the house. I wasn't the biggest fan of the last head coach, but when I met Coach Freeman, he was different.
That's really rare for a kid to admit that.
Yes.
And B, I mean, they probably are very different personality-wise.
They are. And it wasn't – the thing that hurt Notre Dame, it wasn't just Kelly. It was also
go ahead and say it.
Quinn.
There it is.
And he didn't want to play for Jeff Quinn. And so his desire to kind of look to Notre Dame started to grow when the rumblings came out about Jeff Quinn not coming back next year, and obviously that's going to factor into it. I mean, the kid – this is the first commitment of the Marcus Freeman era. He committed to Notre Dame. Yeah. They don't have a line coach.
That's bizarre. That's bizarre because those guys
you don't see that exactly. You'll see that with other positions,
especially
not O-linemen. And I think that says a lot about his relationship with Tommy Rees, and it says a lot about ultimately that this is where he wanted to be. There just were some stumbling blocks in Notre Dame's way, and one of those stumbling blocks decided to head to LSU a couple weeks ago, which I think the program ultimately will be better for. But at the end of the day, however they got here, Brian, this is a huge, huge pickup for Notre Dame.
I was surprised because I remember calling you February or whatever, like Notre Dame's going to get this kid.
Yeah.
And then later you said, yeah, he's kind of silently committed. Then you said all of a sudden they're out. I'm like, what in the world happened?
Yeah.
You know, I don't follow Notre Dame like I used to living down here in Florida, but I'm like, this is bizarre because he fits the profile. And I said, well, okay, Wisconsin, okay. But then they got into the season. Notre Dame beat them, and they are, by the way, Wisconsin's offensive coordinator stinks. They are the definition of not maximizing opportunity.
Yes.
That aside, probably didn't help with getting Billy or anybody else for that matter. But I'm like, something's goofy because you can tell he wants Notre Dame because in-state Wisconsin kids that are quote unquote coveted by the Badgers, it's lock, stock, and barrel. Alabama doesn't get a kid they offer out of that state. You know, it's just weird. So for them to go that long and him not to publicly announce, I'm like, this is one of the oddest recruitments ever. And I remember a week or two ago, we talked about it, you know, off the record. I was on the phone with you. And I'm like, I really don't have any idea at this point. I've read every report. I subscribe to 247. I read Tom's stuff. Nobody really knew. And I got to the point I didn't even read anything about it because it went both directions about 5 times. So, but the one thing I do know is I watched his film one time going junior into senior year, didn't need to see any more. Forget the school he's going to. And I'm straight up a Notre Dame fan, total homer. He'd have went to Wisconsin. Oh, there's no way around it. He'd have went to Wisconsin. I would have said the following as well. Barring injury, he is a 3-year player, potentially gone, and at worst 4 years. He will never see a 5th year, barring injury in college football, even if he redshirts, because he's a National Football League player. Period. You don't say that about guards. He could play tackle, but I mean, I think his best spot would be right or left guard. Maybe he can play center. I don't know. But he's an interior lineman, and he has feet to move laterally and play in the screen game. He has the feet to pass protect, and most guards at this level, that's a struggle. He can do that, and he will beat the living crap out of you in just straight ahead gap blockers. It doesn't matter. He will get his hands on and move you. Notre Dame got a great player.
20 years ago, I think he could play defensive tackle in college. Not in today's game, not in today's game, but 20 years ago when you needed your tackles to be big space eaters.
Yeah, he could have been
a defensive lineman. He's a good defensive lineman. Yeah, no question. This is a big pickup. Now, I've kind of felt for the last month or so that this was ultimately going to be the outcome, but it was one of those things where the longer it went out, you like you said, you think that you're hearing this, but with this kid, you end up kind of taking nothing for granted. But because number one, he doesn't really put a lot out there, you know, and he's not a kid that engages with the media a ton. He just kind of likes to go play ball, which is ultimately what I want a lineman to be. I was literally dead set on the fact that he was just not going to commit publicly. He was just going to tell the coaches and then sign. But now, luckily, he put something out, you know, and I'm glad he did that. But for Notre Dame, obviously, it gives them some good publicity. But this is a really, really big pickup. I like Billy as a player. You know, he's ranked, I think Rivals has him at like number 125. 247 and ESPN have him outside the 200. He is not. There are not 200 football players in the country better than Billy Schrauth.
I think there's twofold with that. He doesn't do a lot of interviews and all that. That's not good for them. Number one, or any network. It's just true. Quotes sell for guys. We need clicks. They don't pick up the phone or send a text. It's not helpful. And he's an interior offensive lineman. That is quote unquote not sexy.
Right.
It doesn't mean that Nick Saban wouldn't have taken his phone call. I guarantee you he would have. I don't know if he'd have taken him, but like, look at it this way. I have told you for years we need to get more players out of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, etc. I don't really look at Wisconsin that way. It's not, geographically it's easy to get to and all that. There's not a lot of players. But think about this. When was the last time Notre Dame got a player out of Wisconsin? They offer somebody pretty much every year. If Wisconsin offers them, you just don't get them.
Yeah.
I mean, Greg Pauly, that's 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
I think that's it.
Because I'm thinking like Matt LaVore was from Pennsylvania. Floyd is from Minnesota.
Yeah.
I honestly can't think of a player from Wisconsin that Notre Dame.
Brian Bedash was offered, but Wisconsin didn't offer him. So
right.
That was a Greg Madison find. He was a good evaluator. But that's about it.
It's been a while. Well, and this was a unique year because you had 3 top 100 caliber offensive linemen from Wisconsin. They normally don't have that. They normally have like those, those 3-star kids that only Wisconsin wants, and then they develop them. And by the time they're, redshirt juniors, they're really good football players. The thing about Billy that I like is he is not your typical not your stereotypical Wisconsin offensive lineman. He in some ways big. He's 6'5". He's got long arms. That's the thing I like, Brian. He's got the length to play tackle. He's got the feet to play tackle. He's athletic. That's the key for me. That part right there. Joe Bruner, to me, the kid that actually of the three, I only think one of them is going to end up in Wisconsin. I think
Really?
I won't be shocked if Carson Hinsman ends up at Ohio State. I think only one of them for sure is going to end up Wisconsin, and that's Joe Bruner. Joe Bruner is the stereotypical Wisconsin kid, 6'6", 305, not overly athletic, kind of stiff, but physical. When you look at Billy Schrauth, in some ways he's your typical Wisconsin kid because he's big, he's long, and he's physical. What he has and what Carson Hinsman have that you don't normally find from the really northern kids is athleticism.
Yes.
And that's the thing I love about Billy. He is athletic. And that's why you and I have both said he doesn't play tackle, but he could. If Notre Dame was dead set on him being a right tackle and they said, we're going to put him a right tackle the day he gets here and we're just going to coach him up and work on him, and they're going to have a new O-line coach, and I'm assuming it's going to be someone that's going to be able to coach at a high level. I hope it's going to be someone who's going to coach at a high level. Then that kid would be starting to right tackle in a couple years. Now,
by the end of his sophomore year.
Right. Now, you don't do that because you just say, we're going to figure out fastest way to get him on the field. Okay. Sure. And that's how it should be. The point being is if they wanted to dedicate themselves to getting him comfortable in space, I think he could do it. That's the kind of player he is. And you just you find a lot of tackles that can move to guards. You don't see a lot of guards that you're like, yeah, I think that guy should play tackle. And so I think that helps to this because it answers your point. I mean, to me, he could play 4 of the 5 starting positions on Notre Dame's offensive line. I don't know if I would put him at left tackle. That's a reach for me because we just haven't seen him do it. But from left guard to right tackle, there's not a position on the offensive line that I don't think this kid can play. And then you talk about adding him to a class that already has Joey Tonona, already has Ty Chan, already has Ashton Craig, now has Emil Wagner. That is about as good of a 5-man class as you're going to find. Because I made this point earlier, Brian, and we'll bring John Garcia on here in a second and ask him the same question. You look at last year's 5-man class. To me, Blake Fisher's better than everybody else that's in those 2 classes. I mean, Blake Fisher is like a 5-star caliber stud kind of player. I believe SL American had him as a top 50 player last year. No, they had him in the 60s. I think he's a 5-star caliber player. But you look at 2 and 3, you had Schrauth, and then you had Rocco, and then Joe Alt, who we thought was a project, but turned out to be ready as a freshman. And then Caleb Johnson and Pat Coogan. So like 4 and 5 are just kind of more like, depth players and all those kind of things. You look at the 5 kids in this class now. I mean, to me, I grade Emil Wagner out as 5th. If you have an offensive line class where Emil Wagner is your 4th or 5th guy,
you're rolling.
That is a heck of a class. And the only reason Emil's 5th for me is the size. I don't know. I mean, you see him on the basketball court, and you're like, that kid looks like a defensive end, not an offensive tackle. That's my only concern. But when that kid's your 5, that's one heck of a class. But Billy Schrauth was the key to that because Billy is the only guy that I view as a top guy. Like, I don't view Tonona, Craig, Chan, or Wagner as top 100 recruits. They're like 150 to 200-ish kind of guys, maybe some upside of higher. But Schrauth was important because you need that dude. And I think he is that dude.
I love Tonona, but I like him and I have no idea who the new O-line coach is going to be, so this is irrelevant. But if the new O-line coach sticks him at center because of his feet, that spot is so hard to play now.
Yeah.
If he can play that with his athleticism, he's possibly a top 100 player.
Yeah.
But, but he's not as strong in his – I mean, like Billy will beat you to death.
There's some guys with upside of a top 100 player.
Oh, yeah.
Emil Chan has the upside of a top 100 player. Emil Wagner, if he can fill out, has the upside of that. But there's just Ashton Craig, to me, had a great senior year. So I want to bring on John Garcia first. And John, I just wanted to open up to you, number one, just kind of your thoughts on Billy Schrauth as a football player.
You just said it, man. That's a football player. I think when we get into this business, there's so many different pools we have, right? High floor versus high ceiling, polish versus raw athleticism, measurables versus what we see on the field, all that stuff. He's like on the top end of every one of those scales. except for maybe the polish. And it's really not his fault. You know, he plays in Wisconsin, triple option offense. That's going to be lean on somebody, come downhill, maybe chip someone at the second level and go pretty much every snap. So I'm curious to see how his transition goes from a technical standpoint, but from a height, weight, physicality, lean standpoint, this is a football player. I love the fact that he supplements the O-line play with some defense. We get to see overall athleticism, pursuit, kind of natural instincts on the football field. And that's where Billy really, to me, elevates his profile. And I'm right with you, Brian. I think he's Brian with the Y. I think he is probably the number one or number two O-line get in this class for Notre Dame. I agree with you on Wagner. So light. There's so much to be determined there physically. I do think Chan, from a pass protection standpoint, has a chance to play pretty early, depending on how he fills out his frame as well. But in terms of a football player standpoint, I like Billy's floor compared to the rest of this group. But it is a good group. It is a diverse group. And when you start looking around the country, this is becoming one of the better groups, if not the starting point for that conversation down the home stretch. So I really like the pickup individually and absolutely collectively.
To me, I look at this and I say, there's some classes I got to work through, but I have a hard time believing that there are 5 classes better, O-line classes, than this group now that Billy Schrauth is in the class.
Oh, yeah.
What are your thoughts, John?
You're right there. First of all, from a volume perspective, there's not a lot of programs that have even 4 offensive linemen committed. So when you talk about building an offensive line class, this is literally one of the few that has 5. And some of them that are bigger or are as big in volume are totally built differently. I think Notre Dame's is as modern a group as you'll see, which is not what conventional wisdom tells us, right? We would think, okay, Notre Dame's got 5 guys, 6'5" or better. Well, my brain goes to, okay, well, they're all probably 320 or heavier, built for the, a Big Ten run first style. No, these are tackles that are lighter, if anything, who are built for the modern game, which I think reflects what Tommy Rees wants, what that offense is going to start to look like moving forward as it continues to modernize. But these other groups that have that volume, for the most part, are heavier. Florida State has 4 or 5, all well over 300 pounds. Stanford's are heavier than Notre Dame's at this point. Penn State has a huge group, but they're all physically bigger than what Notre Dame is bringing in. I think when you start to look at the best classes, Notre Dame, Stanford. I like the Ole Miss group, especially after seeing their banner left tackle this past week down in Mississippi. I think that group is going to contend when all is said and done. But when you look at the perennial recruiting powers, Alabama, Georgia, A&M, Penn State, those schools have smaller groups for the most part. So when you talk about O-line hauls collectively, that conversation is shifting to Notre Dame at the forefront of that discussion. And that's not something that even 12 months ago, we probably thought we would be talking about here as signing day creeps ever so close. So I like the modernization in general for Notre Dame in this entire class, and it's reflected on the O-line.
I think one of the things Notre Dame is really focused on in this class, period, is athleticism. And I think that's the same thing with the offensive line. People say, why don't Notre Dame recruit big guys? Because that's not the kind of offense Notre Dame wants to run. They want to run Quentin Nelson was big. That's not why they recruited him. He's a freak. I mean, he was athletic and huge. Notre Dame has gotten by on the 300 to 305 pound guys that can move. I mean, Robert Hainsey, the Liam Eichenbergs, the Mike McGlincheys, that's Ronnie Stanley's kind of guys. And that's what they want to run. They want to run outside zone. They want to get to the next level. They want to run screens. They want to run RPOs. And the other thing too is a lot of those 315, 320 plus pound guys live in the South. Northern linemen tend not to be as big. And when they are big, they're not athletic. And that's what we were talking about earlier about Joe Bruner. Joe Bruner fits the big guy profile, but he can't move like the kids that they got can move. So I think that's important too. And I think the other thing that's important is we talk a lot at SI All-American about it's not just landing talented players. It's about landing talented players who can play together. And when you look at this class with Chan at left tackle, whether it be Wagner or Schrauth at right tackle, let's go with Wagner for now. Then you've got Tanona, Craig, and Schrauth as interior guys. You have a starting 5 caliber offensive line. Now, it won't always play out that way, but I think that's important too. If you sign 4 guards or 4 tackles, you wonder about how the fit's going to be. And the thing that's interesting about this is Notre Dame signed is going to sign 2 interior linemen, meaning guys that play inside in high school. That's also not something you find a lot. But obviously, Joey Tonona moved to center as a junior, played it this year, and then Billy Schrauth a guard. But what I find interesting is I would argue that Schrauth, just pure athleticism, is either their number 1 or number 2 in the class athletically, in my opinion. And that's what makes him different as a guard, because normally a high school guard's a guy that can't really move. That's certainly not the case with Billy Schrauth.
He can
it goes against the triple option perception too, right? You think, oh well, triple option, these guys are just kind of road graders, but in that scheme, you've really got to be able to push towards the second level. And again, we focus too much, I think, on the viral play, the pancake, just man versus man. I'm better than you. I'm gonna get you on your back. But when you can even wall off a Mike Becker, I don't care if you're in Wisconsin, Indiana, Montana, if you can wall off modern day high school linebackers after completing your assignment at the line of scrimmage, you can move. And when you think about the size that Schrauth brings along with it, it becomes more intriguing. So I'm right with you. I think he's probably the number 2 guy behind Chan in the class, just in terms of fitting the modern game. But I think that position flexibility is so critically important. I think you could see him start off as a guard at Notre Dame and then down the line maybe push out to right tackle. He might even be able to play both guard spots, which is really hard to do. So this is a critical kind of icing on the cake piece for this Notre Dame O-line group.
I think there's something else about Billy Schrauth that to me signifies what this class is for Notre Dame up front. I think when you look at the current Notre Dame roster, you see some bigger guys and you see some smaller guys and you see this mix of players. The one consistent I saw from this line that I think caused this line not to be as a typical Notre Dame line is there wasn't a lot of pop. There's not a lot of starting linemen for Notre Dame that just kind of pop you. Even Kane Madden, he kind of gets by on just throwing his weight around a little bit. Notre Dame doesn't have guys on the current line that can just come off and punch and move. The thing I like about this class, and everybody focuses on the weight, and I don't care what their weight is as high school seniors. But when you watch these kids, and Billy Schrauth epitomizes this, these are kids that come off and they have powerful hands. And I think that is something that I really like about this group as well. They're athletic, but they can strike, and they are tough kids. Even Emil Wagner, who's 260 pounds, you watch him play, he's got punch. Now, will he fill out enough to be able to actually move people or hold up? That remains to be seen. But he will fight, and that was the thing that probably surprised me the most is he'll pop you. That's something that I love about this class. Brian, what are your thoughts on that aspect of this class? And then, John, I'll go to you next with the same question.
I'm glad that Notre Dame finally got that guy. The big fella they had at left guard last year, I mean, when he hit somebody, it changed on 3rd and 1. He's in the NFL for a reason.
Right.
They don't have that guy this year.
Right.
And I know part of it was O-line coaching, and I know Billy's not going to walk in and do it. But there's a part of that in practice. When you see your teammate doing that, it's collective. You guys want to, it's a group. O-line's a weird kind of deal. It's a chemistry thing. It's a mentality. Billy's going to bring that. And the guys that don't want to play like that will be the ones standing next to the coaching staff on the sidelines. Notre Dame they're not going to out-athlete. We talk about this all the time on the phone. You're not going to out-athlete Georgia. You're just not. A&M, you're just not. But you can beat the crap out of them. That never changes in football, and it's why it's so unique, and it's my favorite sport. If you go through somebody, it kind of takes the breath out of somebody. It's 3rd and 2, and you get a 5-yard run when everybody in the stadium knows you're going to run the ball. Those athletes aren't as valuable at corner, at receiver, et cetera, because they're standing over on the sidelines, the offensive guys, et cetera. That's what Notre Dame football has been traditionally, and now they're starting to get some other athletes outside the numbers too. But if Notre Dame's not dominant up front, they are never going to consistently beat Alabama.
They have
Ohio
to.
State. Yeah,
they have to.
That's why he's vital.
And even you look at like in '88, Notre Dame had some athletes that you could say competed with Miami Rock,
sure.
But they're just never going to have the depth of athletes. They have to be able to win in the trenches. And defensive line wise, Notre Dame's been able to play with anybody for the last 4 or 5 years. 4 years, right? 4 or 5 years. I mean, we talked about this. Their 2018 defensive line has 6 guys that have been drafted since then. And that's 2 of those guys are still on the roster. that played on that team, with Myron Tungavaloa, actually 3. Myron Tungavaloa, Kurt Heinisch, and Jason Adamiola were all part of that rotation as well. So defensive line's not an issue. The offensive line has been a little bit more up and down, if we're being honest. And in this stretch of 18 to 21, I would argue that Notre Dame has only had one season where they played like an elite offensive line. I don't think they did in 2018 at times. 2019, definitely not. This year, definitely not. 2020 is the exception. I think you needed 2 strong classes in a row. I think last year's class with Fisher and Rocco at the top, and then with Joe Alt emerging. Brian, you remember us talking about Joe Alt. I gave him a 4.5-star upside. I just thought he was going to need more time. He's already developed. Caleb Johnson providing – I mean, you could argue that Caleb Johnson's your 9th best commitment in the last 2 years. There aren't a lot of teams that could say Caleb Johnson's your number 9 commit. Now, you could argue maybe he's 8 or 7, but he's definitely in the bottom half. There aren't a lot of teams that can do that. I think that back-to-back strong classes has sort of put Notre Dame in a position where, with the right coaching, they've got a chance to quickly get back to being that kind of group. And I think that's going to – because they can't win titles without that. John, to that comment, but also to the original comment about just the even though they're not the biggest group, this is a group that's not only athletic, but they can strike people.
2 things for me on that front. One, how do you compensate for maybe a transition in either philosophy or size? If you have a striking ability, you can start to compensate, especially in the passing game. It's about stunning the opponent. Again, we get so entrenched into thinking pancakes and pushing the defender 5 yards down the field. It's not just walling them off. If you could strike that defensive end, that smaller, the guy who's getting smaller and more edgy, now all of a sudden you're throwing off the timing of that rush. And as we talk about a transition and modernizing, that's going to become more and more important in the timing and the anticipation aspect of the Notre Dame passing game. You have to stun the opponent. Look at the teams that have been great with tempo over the last, 5 years. LSU 2019, Oklahoma, pick your year, Ole Miss this year. Those O-lines didn't have a ton of NFL upside, but they could all zone block and they could all punch. That's really the focal point of getting the ball out right now. It's about chopping those defensive ends who want to go high and stunning those who want to go low. And those are ways you can both transition and modernize almost at the same time. So, yeah, that starting weight and the conventional thought of what an O-lineman should look like entering college all flipped on its head as the game went more spread and went more timing based. And that's even important as you use the passing game as an extension of the run. Bubble screens, jet sweeps, all of that stuff, hitches, tunnel screens, all of that stuff is extension of the run game. So now you can pop somebody and get to the second level, which really becomes a huge weapon when you start to counter what should always be a good traditional Notre Dame run game.
And then, of course, back to Billy Schrauth, I think he epitomizes a lot of the stuff we're talking about. I mean, athletic, can move, versatile. You can find, if you have an opening and he's your best guy, you have a lot of places you can move him to get him in the starting lineup. It reminds me, to me, in regards to the versatility, he reminds me a lot of, to me at the same age, a bigger, more physical, stronger version of Jarrett Patterson coming out of high school. Because remember, Jarrett was a little bit, 275. Jarrett wasn't a thumper, never been a thumper, but Jarrett was athletic and he could play a lot of positions. Jarrett Patterson was a left tackle in high school that's going to get drafted either this year or next year as a center, right? And could play guard, could play tackle. To me, that's the thing I love about Billy Schrauth is that versatility where I could view him as being a multi-year starter at center, both guards, tackle. That's the comparison. If you want to know a more physical version, more physical version is Jarrett Patterson is really what I see from him from a body type and a strength. I mean, in a upside standpoint. Thoughts on that?
Has
John?
he snapped at all? Do we know if he snapped the football at all?
Neither did Jarrett Patterson.
You talk about a way to sneak into the 99. If I find out stuff like that, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that really starts to change perception. We know he can definitely play all over. And I go back to the D-line stuff. Because when you're playing in a triple option on offense, it's usually stack, shift, depending on where the play is going. And if you have to get to the second level, wall off or make contact if you can. But on defense, it's so much more reactionary. So you get to see the extension, the redirection ability, how well he transitions when he doesn't know where he's going. So that you start combining some of those athletic traits with center and guard as opposed to right tackle. Now my ears perk up a little bit more, but
Right.
center snapping, that's one of those things that you can learn, right? It's like a kid with bad hands. I saw an electric receiver who dropped a few passes this past week. It's like, hey, I ain't worried about that as much because you can work on that. You can rep that. You can't rep, 4-4 with a 4-1 shove. You can't do those things, or you can't rep those things out. So that starts to perk my ears up even more with Schrauth. So I think it's just, again, another reason why it's a huge addition, and that's so different compared to pretty much everyone else that Notre Dame has committed on the offensive line.
Brian, I'm going to say something that's going to get John super fired up because I know how John loves this. Do you know that all 5 of Notre Dame's offensive line commits play defense?
Wow, that's a really interesting stat. I don't know. I mean, I've followed Notre Dame since the mid '80s, and Holtz used to take D linemen and move them, just take athletes. Benny Serrato told me one time we recruited against one school, and it's Miami. We had to get faster at every position, so that was their goal. But I still can't remember the last class because even like Quentin Nelson, did he play D-line in high school? I mean, he was a freakazoid.
Yeah, I don't
If
think
he
so.
didn't, that puts it in perspective.
I don't
It
think
was
Bars
hard.
did. I don't think Mustapher did. I don't think McGlinchey.
Wow.
McGlinchey might have earlier in his career.
He got a little tall.
Yeah. But no, they
6'8".
haven't had a lot of them. I mean, last year Blake Fisher didn't play defense. Rocco did.
Yeah,
Rocco was definitely
he's a
defensive
wrestler.
lineman.
Right.
I don't think
That's
did
unique.
Caleb Johnson play defense? Brian, I don't think he did.
The guy that played defense for Catholic was his buddy that signed with Florida. They would put him at nose because he was the bigger guy. Johnson did not.
Pat Coogan did. I mean, looking at their current team, Zeke Correll, I don't think played 2 ways. Christophic did. Andrew Christophic did.
Okay.
Josh Lugg did not for most of his career. I mean, they haven't had a ton of those guys. You don't see a ton of offensive linemen playing both ways nowadays. You just don't see as much 2-way players, period. But to have 5 commitments on the offensive line that play defensive line. And the funny thing is the guy that plays the least amount of defense is Emil Wagner.
He's arguably the best.
Has the most D-line body of anybody they have in the class.
He plays at a school.
Yeah, I'd like that wingspan coming off the edge. My God.
Yeah, he
plays defense. He just doesn't play it as much. I mean, Billy Schrauth is a guy that plays defensive line. I mean, he's just a full-time starter. Ty Chan, same thing. Joey Tanona, same thing. Ashton Craig, same thing. I mean, 20 years ago, all these guys could have been Division I defensive linemen in a system that was geared more towards size and power and eating a block. So, John, I just kind of – I know you love 2-way players, man, so I just wanted to throw that little red meat to you.
I love it. It's almost like a whole nother sport. We get everyone's against specialization and throw me into that conversation too. This is almost like playing a whole nother sport. Not to mention showing me what kind of gritty player you are, showing me what kind of teammate you are to be able to play both ways at near 300 pounds. I mean, that's a lot. We just don't see that a whole lot. So to me, it's almost like saying, yeah, he's a great basketball player, or he wrestles, like Brian Smith said, runs track, whatever, throws in track and field, whatever it is. That's almost like a secondary sport to me, especially if you're good at it and you're productive at it. We talk about it way more at other positions, but again, in this day and age, it's really important up front if you do either. And it goes the same on the flip side. If you're a D lineman that moonlights as an offensive lineman, like we like that too. So yes, the more reps, the more tape, the more you're out there, the happier I am generally.
So, John, before we dive into the film, we'll let you go before we dive into the film because I know you got a million things. Y'all don't understand. John runs SI All-American, right? Do y'all know signing days in like 5 days? John's got some stuff going on, but that's what he thinks about the IB community. I asked him to come on, and he didn't even ask me time limits or anything. I just know he's super busy, so we're going to let him go for in the film. But, John, we appreciate you coming on for sure. I'm going to make a claim, and you tell me if you agree or disagree with it. Notre Dame has 4 position groups that if everybody that's committed signs is arguably a top 5 national class at that position.
Okay.
Wide receiver, tight end, and then the 2 obvious linebacker and offensive line. Agree or disagree? I have to arguably, so that way you have a little bit of leeway. That's the because I would go CJ because you based on SI All-Americans, if CJ signs, you've got 2 top 100 receivers.
CJ's questionable, but we'll see.
If he signs, right? That's what I'm saying. If everybody signs, it's committed now. And that's so I didn't put DB in there because Devin Moore's not committed anymore. And without him, this isn't a top 5 to 10 DB class, in my opinion. Linebacker's a no-brainer, right? I mean,
Correct.
right? O-line now to me is a no-brainer. But I would argue that receiver and tight end, I don't know if I can remember the last time that you could argue that Notre Dame had 4 position groups that you could say arguably, or we could at least have the conversation. Maybe they fall just outside, but they're in the conversation of being top 5. Thoughts on that,
John? What I like is that some of these are on offense and with skill players. I mean, that's from a way out, offense. From a 30,000 foot viewpoint. That's what Notre Dame has needed. And now you're stacking classes together that are having conversations like that. I loved last year's secondary haul. I definitely loved the linebacker haul last year. But when you go on offense, it brings more juice because of the team, because it's Notre Dame. It's like when Bama had their quarterback revolution. Like every team has to go through sort of that natural growth in recruiting where things start to change. And then it's all downhill from there. So if Notre Dame continues to stack skill positions, especially wide receiver, and you get into quarterback, I mean, that's when you could really start talking about getting over some of the hurdles and humps that we've long associated with Brian Kelly, honestly. So that's exciting to see from a macro perspective. But yeah, I think 2 of those are 100% no-brainers. And wide receiver, obviously, if you hold on to those guys, that becomes a no-brainer as well. And for any school to have that with multiple positions, and we're talking some of those premium positions, that's a very, very big deal.
And again, I don't know where these guys are going to fall in the updated SI99 ranking because we only do it twice a year, not every 2 weeks, based on whatever when we want to have. I'll be the one to say that. You guys can just nod and smile. But Tobias Merriweather was, I believe, 46th. And CJ Williams is in the 80s. And this comes a year after you signed Deion Colsey and Lorenzo Styles and Jaden Thomas. And so, again, that adds to it. But at the end of the day, we will always come back to the fact that if Notre Dame doesn't have a great offensive line, they are going to always have a lower ceiling as a team. We saw that this year. I'll put Notre Dame's skill up against a lot of teams in college football. When you look at Kyron Williams, Logan Diggs, Chris Tyree, the receiving core they have, one of the best tight ends in football, one of the best tight end depth charts in football. You don't have many tight end running back combos like Notre Dame has, in my opinion. There are some, there are not many. And yet the thing that held this team back this year was the line. That can never happen at Notre Dame. This group combined with last group, because that's the big thing, guys. You and I both know, you two and me, we all know this. It can't just be one class. It's about how you stack them up. And when you can have a group like last year, and then you add a group the next year that's even deeper, that's where it's got to be. But Billy Schrauth, to me, and I just want to get your thoughts on this before you leave, John. To me, Billy Schrauth was the key between Notre Dame having a top 10-ish class and a group that is in the conversation for could it be the best, or at least in that top 3 to 5. Getting him was the key because you needed more top-level talent, and he, to me, is a top-level talent.
Yeah, if Notre Dame can hold on to some of the bubble guys that are still, TBD with this class of 2022, maybe I don't know what the corner situation looks like, but if there is a plan to replace Devin Moore, I think you start talking about locking in a top 5 class, which is really hard this year because the threshold of those 3 SEC programs right now is absurd, right? You're talking A&M, Bama, and Georgia. So those last 2 spots are really where the conversation begins for this, at least for the December signing period of 2022. A lot of attrition, a lot of flips going on because of the carousel, which is still somehow spinning on December. What is this, the 10th? Still spinning on December 10th. I mean, Oregon, I just got a text that Oregon, is trying to talk to Mel Tucker. I'm like, what? It's crazy. It's crazy how late this has gone. So Notre Dame, having gone through a transition technically, is really making up really well despite that fact. In theory, you've lost 1 and gained 1 since Freeman became the guy, or since right around when Freeman became the guy. So Notre Dame's in good shape, absolutely top 5 range, and depending on how it finishes, could really be in that mix after that SEC trio.
And, I got to say this, guys. One other thing I love, which you never would have seen under Brian Kelly, the Notre Dame head coach tweeted out a Billy Madison gif today. Obviously landed Billy Schrauth. So I just freaking love that. So John Garcia, S from SI All-American. John obviously is going to be very, very busy. Stay locked into what John is doing. John, tell the people where they can find you.
Absolutely. All free content, siallamerican.com. I think probably by now, Caleb Webb has made his commitment between Michigan and Tennessee. Don't worry, Notre Dame fans. I think it's Tennessee. So that will be settled over there. Jeffrey Mba, #1 JUCO player. That blog is coming out later today. Again, all free, siallamerican.com or si.com/college.
Thanks, John. Thanks for joining us, buddy. Have a good day. And try to find a couple hours of sleep between now and Wednesday. All right.
So we'll figure it out.
I'm gonna have to throw some money his way, but we're going to try to bribe you to come on Wednesday too. I think we're going to have sort of an all day kind of running live show, so we'll have to find some time for you to come and join us on Wednesday.
Let's do it. Sounds good to me.
Start looking at that calendar, buddy, and start locking down some time. So John Garcia talking about the Billy Schrauth commitment and the rest of the Notre Dame class. Have a good one, John. So Brian, now I want to do what you and I like to do really more than anything else, and we're going to pop in some film.
I knew that was what you were going to say.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I don't ever watch film. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, right. Probably like 1 o'clock in the morning. What are you doing, Brian? I'm just watching this kid from some such and such. Okay. Let's watch a little bit of Billy Schrauth film, Brian. We'll share our thoughts on what we see. And I think the big thing is you guys are going to see the big thing that we like is just that punch. This is him at left guard pulling around. You see that quickness, like seeing him bend a little bit, but you see the agility. Watch him working through this trash. You can watch his feet. Really light on his feet, and then just strikes that poor little fella.
He reminds me of a big tight end that's the 260 tight end. Okay, he's not a pass catcher, but the way he makes the guy miss when he was going through there, most O-linemen don't do very well with that.
This is him playing defense. This is what we talked about. Like, this kid is a good – that's not a great play. This kid's a good defensive player for high school. And, again, I think 20 years – look at the end of that play, Brian, too. Look at the length. That's the thing.
That's not normal for a big offensive lineman from the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
It's not.
That's some length. And the thing about him is I don't think his technique is great. I think he's a kid that still has a lot of room to improve. But the one thing I do like about technique-wise, he coils a little too much, but watch him pull his hands back and strike. He understands the importance of striking with his hands. What you see from a lot of high school offensive linemen is they just kind of hit and then bring their hands. He brings his hands early. Look at that.
Oh, that's tremendous.
I mean, he's hitting with his hands before he hits with his face. I love that.
That's what you're supposed to do at the highest level. So I'm good with him doing it now.
Yes. I got to see that. You see it a lot. You see it a lot from him. And that's not exactly it's not a huge, it's not the kind of guy he's going to face in college, but that's not exactly a small high school player he's going against either. This is where his game's going to have to improve is the pass game. He's got to get used to playing in that part of the game. They do not throw hardly at all at his high school.
Yeah, that's just one of those things where Billy hasn't played in it. He has the athleticism to do it. It's just a mindset. If he takes his mind and says, I'm going to learn this, that dude's going to play. Because you already know he can play in the run game. That's a guarantee.
Right.
That's proven.
Right. Yeah. Pull up, get to this next bit of film here. That's it for that particular group. Now, this is senior film as well. So we'll get to this next batch of senior film. I just don't want to have to show everyone the huddle commercial. So here we go.
Yeah, good luck with that. I battle that thing every day.
Mm-hmm. I'm like, hey, I don't smoke. I'm sick of seeing commercials about gum disease. I don't chew tobacco or smoke. Can you give me something that's more relative to what I do? Here's another example. Like, there's some things I don't like about this particular play from a technique standpoint. I don't think he kind of stops when he hits, and his foot, he comes off a little bit high on this particular play. But the thing I love about this clip, however, is look at the hands. I mean, the extent, the speed of the hands, quick hands, he strikes. He keeps his feet moving, so he's able to kind of get over top and scrape and make the tackle. But, there's some things you want to work on as far as a defensive line technique, but I love the hands. I love how much he uses his hands, Brian.
He's farther advanced than some of the kids that I see, literally. And again, I live in Florida, that are going to SEC and ACC schools to play D-line because they use their hands so poorly and they're just freak athletes.
Right.
No
And they hit with their face and then they bring their hands.
And it's terrible. Yeah. They totally have to rechange them at Clemson or Georgia or wherever they go. Yeah.
Here's another example. Again, some things you could work on technique wise, but look at the hands. He understands. I mean, he gets a skill to forearm shiver. All right, I love the hand usage. I love the fact that he doesn't strike with his face first. He uses his hands, and I mean that's just something you really want to see.
Joe Moore would have killed to have coached this kid.
Yeah,
he would have been a perfect pull and pin guy in Joe Moore's scheme. Oh my God.
That's a nice penetration right there. Again, just using his hands, getting that guy back.
Oh, he ate that guy alive. That is just called bull strength right there. I'm bigger and stronger than you, and I'm going to slap you upside the head. I love it.
Yep. Then we'll watch one more film here, and then we will kind of talk about what this commitment means for next season, because I think that's where I think this commitment is going to have a big impact as well, and we'll explain what we mean by that here as well. All right, last little bit of Billy Schrauth film. This looks like
holy cow. Oof.
See, it's like if you look at him, like he's not like bullying this kid. Like he's not like really. I'm trying to think of the way I want to say this. This isn't a play where he's got like a running start and he has that natural pop. You know, he just kind of he just explodes his hips through contact. He's got a lot of natural power.
Oh yeah,
a lot of natural power, and he plays with a mean streak, and that's something that I want to see.
I'm not saying that he's McGlinchey or Nelson, but he plays with that attitude that he wants to know that I was there. And those guys get somebody, it matters.
They don't have enough of that in their current line, in my opinion. Now, part of that is it was Coach Adam, because Josh Lugg played with that in high school. He just hasn't had it the last couple of years in Notre Dame. This is something you don't see Billy Schrauth do very often, pass blocking. But look,
I almost could care less about pass. I mean, it's good to see it, but I know in a year and a half, we'll be able to pull this back up on Huddle and we'll laugh. Because, I mean, it's nothing against Billy. He just hasn't been coached in it. The offense they run and the players they have, you know, he's playing in Wisconsin. There is, without knowing anything about their team, and I mean this literally, I live 2 miles from Tampa Catholic. They don't have one kid at the school he's at that would even sniff the field at Tampa Catholic on offense, at receiver or corner. Not one.
Other than him.
Yeah, I mean, no, like it's skill guys. Like there's no reason to run a passing offense. They can't do it. You know, they don't have the guys.
Watch this get off here. This is the thing I like too. When I talk about working feet through contact, this is exactly what we're talking about, right? He strikes, immediately starts driving his feet, because he actually, if you watch this play, this kid going against him actually wins the leverage battle. So this kid gets under Billy's pads a little bit, right? And this is a kid that's got a little bit of meat on him for Wisconsin high school. But Billy ends up winning this because when they hit, now his base narrows a little bit, but when they hit, he just works his feet through it. Look, his feet don't stop moving.
That's awesome.
When we talk on film about when we were talking about the Notre Dame offensive line this year, and we talk about catching, and this is what we're talking. You don't see this. So watch his feet right here. This is Billy right here at left guard. Watch his feet. He does not stop his feet at the point of contact. This is called playing through contact. This I love. Now, are there things I want to coach up him about on this? Yes, stay lower, right? You want to stay lower. You got a little high. You let that guy win the leverage battle, right? There's coaching points in there. But what you commend him on is the finish and the fact that he keeps moving his feet through contact. I love that. I love that. Because a lot of times you gotta teach a kid to do that. Not a lot of linemen, Brian, have that. Number one, because a lot don't need it because they're usually just so much bigger and stronger than everybody they play. They just kind of push the kids off the line.
Yeah, that's a bad technique to start, because when you get to college and you go against your first one-on-one rep against a real player, you get pancaked the other direction. I've seen that happen at Notre Dame in practices. Get high against a real athlete. Yeah,
Yep. Yep. So let's Brian, let's talk about this commitment from regards to how this impacts the 2023 class.
Sure.
So right now you have 5 offensive linemen in the 2021 class. Only one of them played enough to lose a year of eligibility. Since Blake Fisher got hurt, it doesn't really matter. Blake Fisher's not a 5-year guy.
Yeah, he's never coming back.
Rocco Spindler didn't play. I mean, but point is, that's a young group. Pat Coogan and Caleb Johnson are the other part of that group. I think so far we have to say we have to be pleased with that group since Joe Alt's so much ahead of schedule. Blake obviously was playing very well, and I hear good things about Rocco. Then you look at this group. So you've got 2 years, you got 10 linemen in 2 years. Even if you lose a kid or two, the point is your numbers from these 2 classes are excellent. So what that does for Notre Dame in 2023 is what that tells Notre Dame is the one thing you do not need in 2023, numbers.
Quality over numbers.
Exactly. So if at this point in time, you're looking for fit, right? You may say, hey, look, we need to sign a kid that maybe isn't a top 50 kid because we need a kid that maybe plays a specific position. But at this point in time, Notre Dame can be super picky about who they target in 2023.
I forget the name of the kid. There's an offensive lineman back east, a New Jersey kid or somebody they're in on real high. But
is that Chase Basantis?
Yeah, I believe that's right. Somebody like him.
TJ Shanahan, Caden Proctor, guys like that.
If it's not a top 250 kid, and I'm not trying to be a jerk or, again, I love Notre Dame and I know they can recruit O-line at a high level, but because of the last 2 classes, you're not going to have as many numbers as you noted on the offensive line. So if you take a kid early, he's got to be a surefire, really good football player. I'm talking about taking him in February or March or whatever. And they usually get one of those kids. Maybe they find one that's not as highly rated they really love because he's got a high upside. Boy, they better be sure.
Right.
Because there's why you're in a position of complete power. It's Notre Dame. It's not hard to recruit O-linemen anyway, but you just got 10 dudes in 2 classes. It's just about talent right now and being picky. They could get away with the 2-man class if they were both elite. And I mean,
if they keep everybody in the current class, I agree with that. Yes.
I would prefer not to do that, but if it happens,
I think you always want to have at least 3. You always want to have 3.
Yeah.
It protects against injury. It protects against, because look, somebody in these 2 groups is going to get injured. Somebody in this group's not going to pan out, and somebody may transfer.
Agree across the board.
You always have to do that, and that's true everywhere. So, but the point is, to Brian's point, it doesn't have to be a top 50 recruit. It has to be a kid with an incredibly high ceiling. Sometimes that is a top 50 recruit. Sometimes it's a top pick. Right. Sometimes it's a top 250 type of recruit, like a Ronnie Stanley. Ronnie Stanley was not an elite high school offensive lineman, but you and I both said that kid's got an elite ceiling. And he eventually grew into that. Same with Mike McGlinchey. He was a guy that you and I liked a lot more than the recruiting services coming out of high school because we said when this kid stops playing basketball and he gets into the college weight room, he's going to be 300 pounds and he's going to be a tremendous player. So it's about finding that high ceiling, and that's all they shoot for. But the other thing too, Brian, it doesn't just give you room to work from a number standpoint, but you can be patient. If you're in on a kid and you say, hey, look, we love this kid, he likes us, but he's looking at a lot of schools, this one's going to drag out for a while. Okay. Let it drag out then, because because you're looking for impact over numbers, it takes less of the, boy, you better get somebody soon or you may be in trouble. I think that matters too. That allows them to strive even higher for some of these kids. So not only does landing Billy Schrauth help you now, but adding a 5th offensive lineman to this class puts Notre Dame in a position of power and leverage when it comes to the 2023 class. And it's going to be good too, because you're going to have a new O-line coach. So it's going to give him time to come in and identify who he likes, identify who he wants, and start building that relationship to where if it takes him 6 or 7 months to really get things going, you're okay, because it just matters how you finish. So I think really landing Billy Schrauth in so many ways is going to have a huge impact on where things stand for Notre Dame when it comes to offensive line recruiting.
Well, just to use your point, and this is a kid I'm sure you've either spoken to or you've talked about on your show or your site. There's a kid from Findlay, Ohio named Luke Montgomery that's kind of in the Wagner category. Good athlete, high upside. He's a national recruit, blah, blah, blah. for whatever it's worth, and early rankings for O linemen are dicey at best, no matter what service you're looking at. 247 has this kid ranked in the class of 23 as the number 63 prospect. Hard to rank O linemen early on. There's one or two that are obvious in every class, but even if this kid's 163, his upside is really high.
Well, see that he's an interesting player too, Brian, because right now Notre Dame's recruiting him as a defensive lineman.
Yeah, I saw that.
So
he's an athlete.
Right, but here's the thing about him. He is the kind of kid that he's deciding whether he wants to play defense or offense. If he ends up deciding that he wants, because I think Ohio State's recruiting him as an offensive lineman. Okay. So if he ends up deciding he wants to play offense, then you just say, okay, O-line coach Tommy Rees, you guys take this one over, right? And so you haven't had a kid like that since Tillery.
That's true.
Who has a legitimate decision to make what side of the ball. Like Rocco was, people like rivals listed him as a defensive tackle. Nobody seriously thought that Rocco Spindler was going to play defense in college, right?
Right.
And Billy Schrauth's he's not a defensive lineman in today's game. Neither's Ty Chan. Maybe 20 years ago they could have, which we said earlier. But Luke Montgomery's a legitimate two-way player. Notre Dame likes him on one side, but if he decides he wants to play the other, then you flip him there. But the point that Brian's making that we agree on is you need to find guys with really high ceilings. Because the other thing too is because Blake Fisher's already playing, because Joe Alt's already playing, because Rocco's going to start battling soon, because you have guys in this class, in my opinion, like Billy Schrauth, because that's who we're talking about, that can play somewhat early in their careers. You can afford to take a 5-star upside, but projecty kind of situation next year. Luke Montgomery is that kind of guy, because if he decides he wants to play offensive line,
that's fine.
His early playing time projection is not nearly as fast as it would be on defense, because he's got to build the body up so much.
I'm going to go ahead and throw a name out there, and I'm pretty sure you've spoken about this kid before, and he's what I call a quote unquote 3-clipper. I watched 3 clips and I turned it off because there's no other need. And that's really rare with O-line, and that's Caden Proctor.
Yeah.
He might be as good, if not better, just prospect-wise, than Nwankpa from Iowa this year. It's the best back-to-back combination I've ever seen out of Iowa. That state does not
same high school.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I don't know what the heck's going on in Des Moines, but thumbs up to them. Proctor will kill you. He is physically ready for SEC play as a junior in high school. It's insane. He is a grown man. That's one of those kids Brian was talking about. If he decides, you know what, guys? Okay, Marcus, I'll do an in-home with you. I'll go visit for the Stanford game middle of the year, and I'm sure they'll have a bunch. They always do that game every year, the mid-October game. But I'm not going to decide until January. You have to stay in it for a kid like that anyway, but especially in a year where you're coming off back-to-back 5-man classes. Okay. I mean, Caden Proctor's conservatively a top 20 player nationally, and I think he's a top 10 player. Okay.
He's a no-brainer 5-star now and in the future. I mean,
he could play guard or tackle. It doesn't matter. Freak athlete, blah, blah, blah. 24/7 has him number 6. That's probably about right.
But again, here's the thing, Brian, because you don't have numbers. Let's say he follows Xavier and commits to Iowa tomorrow.
Okay.
Right. Or he commits to Ohio State. Fine. Okay. You're in no rush. Flip him.
That's the same
Notre
thing.
Dame's not often in that situation. They have to say, look, this kid, we can't afford to wait till next signing day to try to flip this kid. Because you've signed 10 kids in the last 2 classes, you're now in position to say, hey, look, especially if you're able to see, here's the thing. If you can identify a top lineman or 2 early and get them early, that's obviously ideal. That gives you even more flexibility to say, okay, for this last guy, we're going to go out and find a dude. And if he's committed somewhere else, so be it. And I think that's awesome. A rare position for them to be in when it comes to the offensive line.
They're in that position at almost every spot. Now, there's a couple on defense that are a little iffy with that, but that's a position that when I started covering Notre Dame in the late 90s, they were 0 positions like that. And that's why so many freshmen and sophomores got, quote unquote, thrown to the wolves. That doesn't always work out well from a mentality standpoint. Some kids got their heads knocked in and they never recovered, if you know what I mean, mentally. Even Proctor, as good as he is, I mean, Alabama, Ohio State, there's a handful of schools, Georgia, that recruit O-line at a really high level. He ain't playing his freshman year unless things really fall right. But he'd be one of the few that could. Like Blake Fisher, we knew had a chance to play as a freshman. Caden, for those of you out there, same kind of athlete, if not better than Blake. It's scary.
When he's longer than Blake is.
Yeah, buddy.
He's taller and longer than Blake is. But, but that's the thing is like, it's a great position to be in. And they've done what's funny is that you often see a class like this put together because of the offensive line coach. And I'm not saying Jeff Quinn didn't have a role in this class. I'm not saying that at all. He did some good things with his class. But this is one of those things where if you're concerned about Tommy Rees as a recruiter, there to me right now is only one position that I have concern with Tommy Rees as a recruiter, and that's quarterback, his position. That's still a question mark to me. But his ability to go out and have as big of an impact on getting commitments from other positions is really exceptional, and it's that of someone who you would expect to have a much more established track record, if we're being honest. The role he had with getting Tobias and CJ and Jadarian Price and Billy Schrauth and Emil Wagner and and the guys that they're getting in this class, the tight ends is really you do not hear an interview with an offensive kid in this class. You have not read an interview, I'll bet you, with any of these kids where Tommy Rees's name is either brought up first or very early in the conversation. And that's a great sign, because if he can be what I and you think he can be as a recruiter, because there's nothing, Tommy Rees is just getting started. He's 29 years old. He's not going to get worse as a coach or recruiter, most likely, unless he just stops caring. And you and I both know Tommy Rees did not where he got to because he doesn't work, right? But you've got a head coach that values recruiting. That's only going to make Tommy Rees even more dangerous on the recruiting trail. And this is an example of that. How often do you get an offensive lineman out of the backyard of a program known for producing offensive linemen when you don't even have a position coach? And in this case, your position coach was a hindrance to getting that kid.
This, to my knowledge, this is the first offensive lineman that Notre Dame has signed out of Wisconsin in 20 plus years.
I can't remember the last one. I really
Greg Pauly probably should have been, but that's another argument. They probably offered 10.
Mm-hmm. I honestly can't remember the last one. I can't remember one in the Rivals era. I'm going to go, when we're done with the show, I'm going to go back and look.
I don't think so. That, unfortunately, I used to write about this all the time when I worked with Blue and Gold, etc. State U is hard to beat. I don't care if they are 1-11.
Yeah.
When you go to class, and I know a lot of Notre Dame fans, blinders, I go to these high schools. Heck, I go to inner city, Fort Lauderdale, all over. The in-state pool, the coaches, it is real. They try to get their kids to go to their favorite school. Flat out. And in Wisconsin, there's one institution. One. Period.
Yeah.
You say the word Michigan, it's like a 4-letter word to them. You say Notre Dame, it's like a 4-letter word. They don't care.
Yeah.
There's push. And then in the classroom, I'm sure half the kids grew up Wisconsin fans too.
And look, Brian, if this was a cornerback recruit or a receiver recruit or, any other position offensive line, it wouldn't be as big of a deal. It's Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, but they put guys in the NFL from local.
Offensive line.
Yeah, you're part of the tradition. Come on, join us.
Yeah,
I get it.
Huge deal. Yeah.
Yeah, and isn't the head coach an O-line guy?
Chris, and their OC's an O-line guy.
I mean,
their linebackers coach is an O-line guy. They have 3 former O-line coaches on their freaking staff. One of them coaches defense.
That might explain a few things, but that's I'm a pretty sarcastic and glass half empty guy. That's concerning to me. Okay.
Are you saying that's why they barely scored over 20 points a game this year? You could be correct.
Is
that why you're saying that's why the Notre Dame defense outscored Wisconsin's offense when they played in October, September? Yes, you could be correct. Let's get to a couple super chats here, Brian, before we wrap things up. And we jump. Well, we did kind of talk about what's next with offensive line, what's next with the 2022 class. I think right now the focus is on sign who you have.
Agree.
After the 15th, you then reevaluate who's still on the board, and then you go from there.
Agree.
Jim K with a super chat. Thank you, Jim. Hopefully this is an indicator of how effective Tommy Rees can be on the recruiting trail with real support from the head coach. And Jim, this is exactly what we're talking about. And Jim said this way before we just talked about it. So this is a great observation by Jim. And that's the exciting thing for me and why it's so important that Marcus Freeman make good hires when it comes to filling out the staff, of getting people that are at least good recruiters, because if he can just get people that are good recruiters between him as the head coach and helping on defense with Mike Elson and Mike Mickens on defense, with Tommy Rees on offense, you now have some very strong recruiters at very important positions. And I think that is something that is encouraging in regards to Notre Dame being able to get some of these players. Because like the thing that has always bothered me is this notion that Notre Dame can only bring in like 40% of the players because academics. There's more kids they can't get to school because they're not willing to pay, rightfully so, than kids they can't get. Yeah, exactly. Then because they can't get kids into school. But there's also, and you also know this, Brian, there's a lot of kids out there that aren't for sale. Notre Dame needs to start finishing on those kids.
That's number one.
Because that's always been true. Kids were taking money back in the 80s when Lou Holtz was signing number one classes and Notre Dame wasn't paying players, right? Because there's enough kids out there with top talent that don't need to be bought or can't be bought. Those are the kids Notre Dame needs to start landing that they've been missing on. And it requires a great recruiting operation. And now you finally have a head coach that not only takes it seriously from we need to recruit, but he's going to be the leading the charge. And then from what we've seen from Tommy Rees so far, it's very encouraging about what this recruiting staff could be moving forward. Brian, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that what you said earlier, I've been trying to wrap my head around it. I can't remember the last time like Notre Dame didn't have an O-line coach entrenched and they went out and got an elite O-lineman, let alone not to even have one at all. Right. And I don't care if you're Alabama, you go through coaching changes. But that's just weird. Those guys, for whatever reason, O-linemen do not just jump on board. Now, he obviously liked Notre Dame and he was recruited by them all. He doesn't know who the freaking O-line coach is going to be. I can't put that into a category because there is no precedent for it with Notre Dame, to my knowledge.
Right.
That is his high. I give Tommy the utmost respect with that. And we talked this past summer. You said like, well, Tommy works hard, but he hasn't done much yet because he hasn't coached long. He doesn't have a lot of help. Meaning, I know you were talking about,
and he doesn't have an established resume of what he's done.
And now, I mean, they were pretty good offensively this year, but I still think they were hindered, and I'm being nice, with what was at the O-line coaching position.
And that's why the final 6 games were so important.
Oh yeah, they figured it. I'll give them credit; they did better.
Well, Kelly finally got out of the freaking way. As simple as that. And it helped that they had a schedule that helped. But the point is, he now has film to show, hey, look what our offense can do now. You know, you show the Florida State game, you show the Stanford game, you show the Georgia Tech game, you show the North Carolina game. You now have film to say, look, we're going to spread this sucker out. We're going to run different schemes. We're going to get the ball in space. It's not theoretical anymore. You now have film on it. He now has 2 years as an offensive coordinator in which Notre Dame has gone 21-3. He now has more of an established track record to now he's going to put in the same work he has been putting in, but now he has a little bit more kind of behind him. And then, as you said, you add the head coach. He doesn't have to do it by himself now. Mike Elson doesn't have to do it by himself now. Mike Mickens isn't out there doing it by himself now. I think that's going to be a big part of that as well.
Here's my last point. And I know you put this up on your message board last night and I read it. It was later. I'd have called you. There are a lot of guys that would love to be the O-line coach at Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, and in this case, Notre Dame. Marcus Freeman is now fielding calls instead of making calls, and which is bizarre.
To the people that aren't on the message board, what we put up, Brian's referring to, is I put an update last night that I've now talked to a few sources that said part of the reason that the offensive line hiring is going to take a while is because they're getting a ton of calls. And I'm not talking about the calls like, hey, the guy from, Kansas State called, or the guy from Stephen F. Austin called. I'm hearing big time colleges, names that people recognize, and including a couple NFL people.
I'm just going to throw this out there, and you and I agree wholeheartedly. I'm going to probably butcher his name, so my apologies. In my opinion, in the last 5 years, the 2 best O-line coaches are the guy that is now the head coach at Arkansas. He was at Georgia. And then the guy that I don't know where he's going to go next year. I hope it's Notre Dame. Bill Bedenbaugh, the guy at Oklahoma.
I think he's going to stay at Oklahoma. I think.
I mean, if he didn't take the USC gig with Lincoln already, I'm guessing he just doesn't seem like LA's a different deal. Yeah. I mean, it's just not for
He's a Midwestern guy. He coached at West Virginia. And I don't think that's a great fit. But
I could see him fitting at Notre Dame. But
some guys like that are interested. Now we'll see. We'll see how it shapes up. But I have been told that they're surprised. There was some surprise at just how many coaches reached out for that. I'll put it like this: there were more coaches that reached out, like legitimate, like could do the job, that reached out to coach the O-line than reached out to coach to be the head coach.
That is wow.
Yeah.
I mean, being the Notre Dame head coach is a pretty good gig. So that puts it in perspective, because these guys aren't dumb.
Right.
They look at the recruiting rankings like we do, and they recruit these kids.
Right.
If I go there, I've got a ton of talent. This is an easy job.
Right.
They're not dumb, man. They know I get to coach Blake Fisher. That's a good deal.
And Joe Alt and
I get to have 2 NFL tackles from the time
they just
I
got a
walk
commitment from a top 100 kid who we didn't have a coach. All right, cool. I think I can recruit there.
Yeah. I'm not shocked they had some, but to have more than the head coach, that does surprise me. Good for them.
Yeah. Here's a super chat from Jeffrey Richardson. Who are you thinking a good O-line coach hire would be? I used to listen to you on Rivals, but once you left, so did I. Thank you for that. I'm so glad to find your content and analysis again. Jeffrey, I'm glad that you found it as well, and welcome aboard. So, Jeffrey, I have purposely not put names out because, number one, I don't specifically know a lot of the names, and I don't want to put a name out and then it comes across as if I'm like saying a name that I've heard, when in fact it's just me saying I like the guy. Okay. The other reason why is because I have found in the past, this was learning from my mistakes, I would put some guys out that I liked. And if the list that Notre Dame worked from was not the list of guys I liked, it was often perceived as then I didn't like their list. When in reality, there's probably 15, 20 guys in college football and 6 or 7 guys in the NFL that could come do this job at a really high level. And I don't know who is or isn't interested specifically. So I've tried to avoid that as much as I can. And I'm going to continue to do that, because the reality is there isn't just like, if you don't pick one of these 4 guys, they're screwed. Right. I mean, when Brian Kelly was trying to replace Harry Heastan, there was 4 or 5 guys up for the job. The guy he hired was the one I didn't want him to hire, but people say, well, which one of these guys do you like best? And I'm like, I don't care. Pick one of those guys and you're going to be fine. And that's what I believe about this. There's a lot of good O-line coaches out there. And there's a lot of guys who are good recruiters that would be great recruiters at Notre Dame because they'd have the power of the Notre Dame offensive line brand behind them. And you just got to make sure you hire one of those guys. You got to hire someone who understands how to teach technique, how to understand how to play with physicality, and a guy that understands how to sell the University of Notre Dame. And whether that's hiring an alum like Andy Heck, who's with the Chiefs, and I'm using that just as an example, or someone who's a lifelong college coach, I don't care. Give me a technical coach who understand who can coach toughness, who's willing to do what he's got to do to get the top classes. They sign that. I don't care if it's someone that would have been on my list or not. That's my stance. Brian, do you have any comments on that?
I think you hit it. You really got to want to be at Notre Dame.
Mm-hmm.
State U is a different gig, man. I've been blessed to be around a lot of coaches at a lot of schools and have those quote unquote off the record conversations. Notre Dame is not for everybody. Mm-hmm. It's just not. You got to recruit kids that fit, and you have to stop recruiting a lot of kids that might even be better. That doesn't go over well with a lot of coaches. Mm-hmm. Too bad. This is what it is. Do you want to work with this? Now at O-line, it's the easiest of the positions maybe tight end, take your bait. But O-line coach, still, do you want to be at Notre Dame? Do you want to go and recruit kids that you're not going to buy? Because where I live, a 7-figure check to get a kid is nothing. Nothing. Mm-hmm. For those people out there don't believe, garbage.
And especially the NIL stuff. And
I'll get into that after signing day, but 7-figure has went into another, stratosphere with recruiting. And I mean that literally because of NIL. But there's nothing Notre Dame can do about that, but I'm not going to buy that there aren't Notre Dame alums that are going to try to set up kids and talk to them whether Notre Dame knows about it or not. If you come here, I'm going to hook you up. That's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But Notre Dame's the coaches, they're not going to use it like SEC schools. They use it as a recruiting tool in the sense, this is why you're coming here, because we're going to buy you. Notre Dame's not going to do that, and that's not for every coach. And I'm glad, and that's why I root for Notre Dame. If I wanted to root for a renegade program, I'd root for Georgia. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? They don't care. Mm-hmm. But this is why Notre Dame is special, and it's why I root for them. But I think Notre Dame will get the right guy for them. Tommy and Marcus, they get it. Or else they would have went to LSU. That told me a lot. And I think that they'll get whatever guys, and I have no idea what the list is that you've seen or heard about.
Mm-hmm.
If they have those kind of guys and you're posting that on your message board, these are guys that could coach in the NFL, or they are, as you mentioned, actual NFL coaches. Very good sign.
So we had some people talk about this in the chat, and I just went and checked Twitter because, Twitter is never wrong. But in this case, it does appear to be true that Ohio State is going to pay Jim Knowles, the defensive coordinator for Oklahoma State, $1.9 million, making him their highest paid assistant coach. And also that he is now not going to coach in the bowl game. So, which I do not like. The only way that I'm okay with that is if it was Mike Gundy's decision. That I'd be okay. If Mike Gundy said, "Hey, you took another job," where because it could be a situation where if he's thinking, "I want to promote from within," now you've got a 15 practice trial period to see what kind of job the guy you may promote from within can do. So he will. So according to Brett McMurphy and a couple other people, it looks as though Jim Knowles will not coach the bowl game for Oklahoma State. So no Brian Kelly, no Jim Knowles, no Kyle Hamilton, no Kyron Williams. One of those for sure, I think, is a benefit to the team involved.
I didn't even know Kyron wasn't playing, but I mean,
yeah, that was announced right before we jumped on our earlier show. And
I can't blame him.
Yeah,
it's a running back.
So that's kind of that's the interesting thing. This is a big commitment as of right now. I do not anticipate Notre Dame getting any new commitments as of right now of players out there. I think right now their focus has been on keeping the kids in the class. I do think that they're going to kind of look over their board again after signing day on the 15th, see who else is out there, and make sure that they don't rush into a decision. Because I think that's where the transfer portal has changed things a little bit for a program like Notre Dame is you don't have to hustle up to get a kid because you have a depth need now, and then you take a kid maybe that's never going to be more than a depth player for you for 4 years when you can go find a kid like that in the transfer portal and you only have to be locked into him for one.
It's hard.
And I think that's going to be the where we're going to see is, do we need to fill these needs with, is there a recruit out there that we think can be a really good player for us? Or do we go get a transfer kid to decide? Or in some cases with Notre Dame has a ton of 5th and 6th year decisions to make. And you could just as easily say, hey, we're going to bring so-and-so back for a 6th year or 5th year that we normally wouldn't have otherwise had we been able to get a kid in the recruiting class. So going to be very, very interesting. Lots of stuff to talk about. Brian Smith, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you being on. I know you love talking Notre Dame football, but I also know you're a very, very busy man. So I appreciate that very much. Everybody, thanks for joining us. We will be back tomorrow night. We will have a show starting at 7:00 p.m. Eastern in the evening. For those who may think that I might be doing a really early morning show, that is not the case. It will be at night. Brian knows I'm not a morning person.
You are not.
7 a.m. is a little bit too close to the time I'm actually going to bed for me to do a show. But we will have a show tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Eastern. We are going to talk about the pending decision by 2023 cornerback Justin Rhett, who is a top 50-ish caliber player in the country in 2023. He is going to make his decision between Notre Dame, Oklahoma, Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee. We have some scoop about him on the Irish Breakdown message board about where we think he is leaning right now. But we will find out tomorrow. We'll talk about the decision he makes. We'll talk about how that impacts Notre Dame, positively or negatively. And then, of course, what's next for Notre Dame at that position. So make sure that you join us then for the Irish Breakdown podcast. So for Brian Smith, I'm Brian Driscoll. Y'all have a great day, and we'll talk to you again very, very soon.